Hi Flosstube, I'm Katie and this is the second episode of Ornamentations. I'd like to start just by saying the most heartfelt thank you to everybody who watched, who commented, who subscribed, who messaged me. It's just been overwhelming. People said the most incredibly kind and flattering things. It was incredible, especially to get a mention from a really established Flosstuber like Susan Stanley, so thank you. Starting a Flosstube was kind of a leap of faith. It feels like you're shouting into the void. Will anyone watch? Will they like what you have to say? Will they like your projects? Is this going to be an enormous flop, really? And I'm just really flattered and overwhelmed and incredibly touched at just what a welcoming and kind community this is. So thank you. And to answer a question that has arisen since my first video, the pronunciation of my last name is Strachan. It's Scottish and it's said pretty much just like it's spelled, except for that the H is silent, so Strachan. And in retrospect, since my name is kind of a mouthful, it probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world to choose it for my handle, but I am really, really bad at naming things. I could not even think of titles for my papers in college, which was a problem because I was an English major. I wrote a lot of papers that I couldn't title. And even though there's definitely a formula for doing this, the kindred stitcher, the proper stitcher, the calculated stitcher, the serial starter, I could not think of anything at all, except for possibly Katie, the socially awkward stitcher, which, I don't know, that didn't seem pithy, so I went with my name. Mouthful, though it is. So in the first episode, I talked about the journey that brought me to embroidery. But there's an entire journey for me within surface embroidery, because back in 2013, I was a novice embroiderer. I had done a little needlepoint with my mom. We had done Christmas ornaments. I had done a little cross stitch, and I was just starting to experiment with surface embroidery. And I was teaching myself the basic stitches. I was just playing with whatever thread I found, and I didn't even really know what I wanted to stitch, so I turned to the obvious. I started with an embroidered book cover. This is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and it's meant to look like an embroidered book cover, but it is in fact a box that inside has a pivotal quote from the novel. And I'm not being coy in partially opening this. That's a flaw in the design. This is the first box I ever made, and I put the mat board too close together, so it has nowhere to go when you try and open it. This is quite literally as far as it goes. And I also, not sure if the camera's really gonna focus on this, but I was carrying my threads. I was not being careful with my ends, and so the dark red on the white, especially because it's fairly open weave, really shows through. So this is kind of where I was at as a novice embroiderer when serendipity happened, and I just wandered across, I really don't even remember how, Cabinet of Curiosities, which at that point was a relatively new course being taught by Trisha, Thistle Threads. I was in the second running in 2013, and Cabinet of Curiosities is, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but I'd like to start with the fact that Cabinet of Curiosities made me into the stitcher I am today. That is not an exaggeration. I cannot say enough about this class. The depth of the research, the incredible objects that it examines. You learn so much. It's fascinating. It just opened up new worlds for me. And I have been hearing a rumor that Cabinet of Curiosities might be running again at some point, maybe soon. I don't really know if that's true, but if you're at all interested, I will link to all the relevant information below. Trisha is running some actual Casket courses as well, and check it out. Get on her waiting list, her mailing list, whatever, if you think you might have some interest, because it's incredible, and you don't need to be an experienced and advanced or an excellent stitcher to do it. I really had no idea what I was doing when I started Cabinet of Curiosities, and it spat out someone who could actually stitch, execute, and finish a casket. So Cabinet of Curiosities is about 17th century embroidered caskets. And casket does not mean box to bury a dead person. It means casket in the archaic sense, as in a decorative box for storage of jewelry, of valuables, whatever. And when we say embroidered caskets, that's referring to a very specific period of English amateur embroidery in the 17th century, when this style of elaborate embroidered boxes briefly appeared. People did them, and then it disappeared for centuries, along with many of the materials used to make them, until Trisha came along, determined to do reproduction caskets. So obviously I don't own a reproduction one, but I do have one of the definitive works on the subject, which is Twixt Art and Nature. Ooh, sorry for the glare. English Embroidery from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1580 to 1700, Twixt Art and Nature. This is a low relief historic embroidered casket on the front. You get a glimpse of the very elaborate interior in the back, although this is just the tiniest suggestion. They have sliding panels, they have hidden drawers, they have hidden compartments. It's just, they are like little puzzle boxes of mystery and wonder. So Twixt Art and Nature is a really good primer on some of these pieces. It is, however, out of print. It is unbelievably expensive on the secondary market. I bought this when it was in print. But Bard has made an authorized, not pirated, PDF available for download, which I strongly recommend you do, even if you have no interest in actually stitching a casket, because it's just an incredible work on a fascinating period of historic embroidery. I will link to the PDF in the description below. I don't know how long it will be up, so download it, read it. It's incredible. So this is an embroidered casket. This is the subject of the course. And so I started Cabinet of Curiosities in 2013, and I was so excited. I downloaded the templates. I had this whole idea in my head. I started sketching, and then I just crashed back to earth. It suddenly hit me that I was a novice. I couldn't do anything more advanced than stem stitch and satin stitch, and not even those particularly well, and that I did not have the skills, the confidence, the design ability to cope with such an enormous, ambitious project. I was freaking out. I mean, really freaking out. And at this point in my journey, I was really essentially doing this alone. I am not a member of a guild. I don't have a stitching circle. You know, my friends around here, they don't stitch, and my mom does stitch, but she does cross stitch. And so, you know, I was just kind of feeling my way around with needle and thread alone in my house. So yeah, I was just overwhelmed and trying to think of how could I get to a point where I could design, stitch, and execute one of these objects, because I knew I wanted to. I was just so enthralled with the idea. I still am. But I also knew that I had a long ways to go before I got there. So I started with this. Well, no, actually, what I started with was this. So in the first episode, I talked about covering a cheap wood box, unfinished, from Michael's with embroidery. this is another one of those boxes. They're still available for sale. I bought it last week because in the future I'd like to do a practical episode about how you could cover a box like this with your embroidery. I know the students of summer school got something a lot like this, slightly different in dimension, but same essential piece. And so we'll be looking at how do you either design or adapt an existing design to cover one of these. How do you do the finishing? How do you get the embroidery on the box? And we'll be talking about surface embroidery, but also about cross stitch, because, you know, cross stitch, there's a lot of it out there. I do some of it myself. I have started a project to do this with. So I hope you're interested, because that's coming in a future episode. So, but back to Cabinet of Curiosities. This is where I started. I bought just a cheap box thinking that at the least I could practice my finishing, and at best I could get a better feel for the design and execution of a box, of the space of a box. How do you do an effective lid? How do you design for the frieze on, you know, the edge of the lid? All of these questions that I felt like I wasn't even prepared to begin to answer, and this is where I started. Well, really the lid is where I started. This was my piece from 2014, and the sides were finished much later, because as in my first episode I said that I had pieces that were close to finishing that I put off during the final steps because I was afraid of the finishing. And this was one of those. I did the lid and then I promptly moved on to something else to avoid the whole finishing thing. As you can see, I did eventually get there, but the struggle was real, the lack of confidence was real, and it took me a very long time to get to that point. And I'm sharing this in the hope that if you feel these things too, you know that you can make the journey, and that, you know, you're not lacking. This is just, I think, a really universal emotion. You can do it. This is the evidence. So this is my interpretation of a historic form that we covered in Cabinet Curiosities called the Flora box. And well, not the Flora box, the Flora style, because some of these were just embroidered panels and some of them were full boxes. And the usual form was of a woman in a floral headdress in an elaborate cartouche surrounded by heavily stylized Jacobean flowers. So a lot like this, but I made some tweaks. The woman is actually styled after a portrait miniature from the Elizabethan era of a woman in mask costume. She's meant to look like a fantasy costume because she is not Flora. I turned to a literary inspiration. As I do, she is meant to depict Gloriana, the titular fairy queen of Spenser's epic, the fairy queen. So she is meant to look magical and not like a normal woman. So she's not dressed like a normal woman. She's in a fantasy costume, and she's in a silver cartouche because I really didn't have experience with metal threads at that point, but I love sparkle, so I knew I was going to want to use them. And you can see this was worked many years ago, so the rough pearl has started to tarnish and darken. There's a little color on the silver passing. The flatworm I used is still very, very bright. So that's Gloriana. Her bodice is mostly needle lace, and then I couched down metal threads, and then the little flowers of her headdress are stump work. And then the flowers are also needle lace. For the most part, they do have some long and short stitch, some applied silk wrapped pearl, and they're edged with stretched silver pearl, which the outlining really just gives them so much pop because they're very tonal. I'm working within a very limited color palette here, which is really something that I love to do, to play with the nuances you can tease out of a very limited color scheme. And so this was where I started my journey with Cabinet of Curiosities. This was the first thing I ever actually did any glued finishing on as well. It has some wobbles, but because it's a flat piece, there's not really any texture on the back. It did glue reasonably well, and the surface looks fairly smooth. You can get a little sense of the texture here when I kind of wobble it back and forth. The sides, which were stitched much later, are the same essential format. The colors are a little brighter, but it's really just meant to accent the lid. This was done, I think, about 3 to 4 years after the lid was, when I decided I needed to get over my finishing issues and just start doing it. So this is Gloriana. This is the start of my journey with Cabinet of Curiosities, which is a recurring theme that we'll be returning to throughout my Flosstubes, because, like I said, this made me as a stitcher, and the space it introduced me to of embroidered boxes, of being able to use this space to tell a story, both inside and outside, is something that I find really compelling, that I love, and that I have consistently returned to. A lot of my intermediate projects were in this form, because while I didn't feel like I could tackle the full size, I was really drawn to the idea of the box. So the journey starts, and then in future episodes we will be getting to some of the places I went from there. Oh, the other thing I want to say about this, the needle lace, the flowers on the lid, this is a very special thread called Gilt Silk Twist. Got a spool here. I'm not sure this is really going to focus very well. There we go. Gilt Silk Twist is a silk core thread that is wrapped with a very, very fine gold filament. So it's got this very subtle sparkle in the light and some really unique characteristics as a thread. It has the color of silk. It comes in a full range of colors, but it has the structure you would find with metal thread. So it doesn't just flop about like silk does. If you put it into a shape, it will stay there, and that has some really useful properties. So I worked this as flat needle lace as a first attempt with Gilt Silk Twist, and then as I grew more comfortable with it, I did some more advanced things, which again we'll get to in future episodes. So after my last episode, well, my last episode, like I've done a ton or something, I was feeling pretty flossy. I had been watching a lot of Flosstube, and I pulled out a chart that I had in my stash, which I had seen some other Flosstubers stitch, and this is Blackbird Designs Anniversaries of the Heart Snow Garden. And I picked this one because of the tonality of the pattern, and also the winter theme, because I do really love Christmas. I'm gonna finish this as a Christmas ornament. And so I've started it. Actually, I finished it, and we'll take a look at my finish in the next episode. But this is my ground. Yeah, it's washing out here in the light, but this is 38 count Legacy Linen Brewer's Malt, which is this really just rich brownish tan green. The color is quite elusive. It's beautiful. Snow Garden calls for Old Town Blend by R&R. I didn't have any. I did have Brewer's Malt, and I do love it. So I decided to adapt the colors slightly to really, ooh, something is catching, to play up the characteristics of this particular linen. So yeah, very tonal, changed out the white here for this beautiful kind of off-white that I think just, yeah, gorgeous. This is a mixed color palette. I used Soie Surfine, Soie 103, Soie d'Alger, overdyed thread, and DMC. I don't have much of an overdyed floss collection. I had to go running to my mom, the cross stitcher, to fill this out. So I kind of grounded my colors in the Blackbird color palette, and then I tweaked it a little bit to fit the linen. So next time we'll really be talking about the substance of that. And I would like to point out, because a friend of mine called me up after my first episode went live and was just like, Katie, what was with your thread presentation there? You know, you were just holding up some skins. Don't you have any thread drops? And the answer was, no, actually I didn't have any thread drops. But now I do. I've got them on a ring. Brenda and Laura of Brenda and the Serial Starter were kind enough to send me some of theirs. And I have had my own made. So if you would like to trade with me, please just give me a DM on Instagram. I will link mine in the descriptions. And these are mine. The actual project this is based on is not nearly this dark. I'm gonna have to have a word with Vistaprint. This is a Stumpwork Rose. It's a little detail shot from a larger piece. Again, something that we'll be looking at in a future episode. And these are my thread drops. If you would love to trade, I'd love to trade. So give me a comment or a DM and we'll trade. So next time we will be looking at my finish of Blackbird Snow Garden, and then we will also be doing a parade of smalls. You've heard of a WIP parade. This is a smalls parade, and a very specific kind of smalls. So another area in studying historic caskets that you learn about are all of the things these girls made to go in them, which are functionally toys because they were girls. I can't remember if I said this, but caskets were stitched much like samplers were, although these were slightly more advanced projects, by young girls. They were a girl's attempt to emulate her mother's dressing box. And so 12 to 14-year-olds were stitching these, which is just mind-blowing when you look at their originals. And because they were girls, they filled them with toys that they made, toys of many kinds. This is covered in Cabinet of Curiosities and in some of the books on the subject. And I have made several of my own, a lot of which are based in flowers. So next time we will have a smalls parade featuring all the different flowers and floral things I've made with different techniques. I'm going to give you a little preview here just to encourage you to watch. This is a posy. There we go. This is a historic technique, but the design is inspired by an 18th century piece of jewelry that I just love, and it's got such great sparkle. I made pretty liberal use of crystals for this to bring in the sparkle since it was based on jewelry. So this is one of the things we'll be looking at next time. And so smalls parade, Blackbird, I hope you'll stay with me to watch. If you liked this video, please subscribe, hit the little alert bell next to it if you want to be notified when I post a new video. I'm going to try to keep to a fairly regular posting schedule, but life does happen. So we'll see how this goes. I hope you liked this. Again, I will link to all the things I've mentioned in the descriptions. I will see you again very soon, and until then, happy stitching.